A 17-year-old in Belgium has become the first minor in the country to be helped to die, reigniting the debate about euthanasia. So how young is too young to make the choice between life and death? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine Dennis. Now, it's been called the ultimate gesture of humanity. For some, it's a show of compassion, but others say it's unethical and is even a form of murder. Now, several countries allow euthanasia, but Belgium is the only one in the world that has no age restrictions. And now, for the first time, the country has allowed a 17-year-old to commit suicide with the help of a doctor. Belgium's child euthanasia law was passed 2 years ago and sets out specific criteria for under-18s. It says children must be terminally ill and going to die in the near future. There should be constant and unbearable physical pain that can't be alleviated. Minors should also understand what euthanasia is and its consequences. They also must be provided with a certified child psychologist or psychiatrist and have permission from a parent or guardian. Well, the Belgian senator who co-sponsored the legislation insists that sick teenagers have the right to decide whether they want to live.
You cannot compare an adolescent that isn't being confronted with illness with a young person who is staring at death in its very eyes. So you have 14 or 15-year-olds very well aware of the situation they're in, and I think it's very important that we, as a society, have given the opportunity to those people to decide for themselves in what manner they want to cope with that situation.
So what exactly is euthanasia, and are there variations of it? Well, active euthanasia is ending a life to relieve suffering, like when a doctor administers a lethal drug. The first country where that became legal was the Netherlands, then Belgium, followed by Luxembourg and Colombia. The Netherlands also allows euthanasia for minors over the age of 12. Then there's assisted suicide, and that's intentionally encouraging or helping someone to kill themselves by prescribing or supplying medication. Now, the important point here is that the patient administers the lethal drugs themselves. It's legal in various forms in Switzerland, in Germany, Canada, and in 5 US states: Washington, Oregon, Vermont, California, and Montana. All right, let's bring in our guests now. In Brussels, we have Dr. Ute van der Werf ten Bosch, a paediatric oncologist at the Flemish Free University of Brussels. In Bude in Cornwall in the UK via Skype, we have Peter Williams, Executive Officer of Right to Life UK, which is an anti-euthanasia and anti-assisted suicide campaigning organisation. And in Melbourne, Australia, we have Philip Nitschke, founder and director of Exit International. He's campaigned successfully to have legal euthanasia law passed in Australia's Northern Territory. Welcome to you all. Ute, can I start with you because you are in Brussels? Do you know any more detail? I understand the need for privacy, but do you know any more detail about this particular case of Belgium's first minor being allowed to use euthanasia to die?
No, we don't know anything more than you do. It's just what has been said in the papers. It's a 17-year-old who's from the Flemish part of the country, and that's all we know so far.
And do you think it was a good thing? Do you agree with this 17-year-old being allowed the right to employ the techniques of euthanasia?
Yes, of course. I believe it's very important that any individual can decide how to orchestrate their death, because it's a human right to be able to do so, even for younger people.
And Peter, in Bude in Cornwall, you're anti-euthanasia, but what are your thoughts and reflections when you hear about Belgium's first case of a minor?
Well, it makes me very sad. Of course, it's always a tragedy when someone dies of terminal illness, but it's a crime when it means the killing of someone, particularly someone who is as vulnerable as someone is when they are 17 and in the state of terminal illness that this person would have been. But this is just the first of many cases that we've had where abuses have happened, I think, in Belgium and places like that. We had, for example, Godelieve de Troyes, who was a woman who was treated for depression and was given a lethal injection, despite the fact 2 experts actually said she was not beyond treatment. But her son was only told about this after the hospital rang for him to come and collect the body at the morgue. We had Anne G, a woman who was depressed after her doctor, her psychiatrist, had tried to sexually assault her, had sexually assaulted her, but she was given a lethal injection. We have Sébastien, who was a gay man who couldn't accept his own sexuality, 39 years old, and again given a lethal injection. And we had Emily, a girl who was just didn't like life. She just said, life, that's not for me. And thankfully, she chose not to go through with the lethal injection, but she could have done. The law would have allowed her to do that at 24 years old. This is the very definition and the very illustration of the slippery slope that has happened in the case of in places like Belgium, where there has been such abuse of this system.
All right, Philip, in Melbourne, I know that you are vehemently pro-choice, pro-euthanasia and assisted dying. But what are the differences in the whole issue, both ethically and practically speaking, when it involves the life of a child? A child, we understand this person was 17.
Yes, I think whenever one talks about introducing a law, and that's what we saw here in the Northern Territory, and certainly it happened in Belgium and Holland, when laws came in, initially there was a decision has to be made about at what age will a person be aware of the magnitude of what it is they're undertaking, because clearly at some point you understand and have under comprehension of the permanence of death. So there will always be argument around the edges, but what I'm so impressed with in the case of Belgium is that when they first introduced the law, they did as we did here and in Holland, that it was for adults over 18. But then they realised that that was a rather artificial divide, because of course teenagers do become terminally ill and they do suffer immensely, and it seems impossible and it seems quite cruel to say to a teenager, well, you've got to wait till you're 18 before you can get the same compassionate response that an adult could. So I think first of all the Netherlands lowered the age to 12. But what the Belgians did, I think, was even more progressive. What they said was there shouldn't be an age. And I think that's the right way to go. It needs to be done under consultation and discussion with doctors, with parents, and with a child who understands the significance and severity of their situation and asks for help. So I can't fault what the Belgians have done. I'm impressed by what they've done. And of course, apart from dragging out, as Peter has done, all these other cases he doesn't like, I mean, we're talking tonight about the story of the person which we know a little bit about, the 17-year-old who was terminally ill. Now, is he seriously suggesting that this 17-year-old should have waited for 12 months and then it would have been all right? I mean, this is just ridiculous. And so, of course, the 17-year-old should have had the assessment that they did and then been given the opportunity of a compassionate end.
And Peter, I can see you nodding your head vigorously.
Yes, I find what I'm opposed to is euthanasia per se, because it is an abusive system. And we've seen this not only in Belgium, but in the Netherlands. We've not only seen cases of involuntary euthanasia, we've seen people being euthanized for simply having autism or other such syndromes and personality problems that could easily be treated than giving people.
All right. Well, I think you've made that point, and I think we understand your position on euthanasia generally. But we are specifically trying to relate this conversation to the needs of the child. So, UTE in Brussels. Now, one of the key criteria that is required for the euthanasia law to be applied in Belgium is the child to display competency. Now, I'm wondering, as a paediatrician, how do you measure competency in a child?
Well, of course, that's something that's usually done by the psychologist and the psychiatrist. But in my general practice, I notice that it's not that difficult. Usually, by the time a child is dying, you know the child really very well. You know the family very well. And you have had many interactions about a lot of things, including difficult decisions about, for example, which treatment you want to initiate or an operation that's coming up. And so you've been through a lot of communications already, and you know the child and you really do know at some point what the child is capable of. That's not that difficult. So I don't measure, but that's a job that's for the psychologist. But we have an interaction, and you get to know what the child is feeling, what the child can reflect on or not.
Okay, well, let's look at a particular case that has occurred just this week. A Belgian Paralympian has been speaking out about how she will choose when she dies. And her name is Marieke Vervoort, and she won a silver medal in the women's T52 400 metres. The 37-year-old has a rare degenerative spinal condition which is progressive and is incurable. Now, she signed euthanasia papers in Belgium in 2008 and has explained what that means to her.
Every time I have to give things away. If you see me years ago, I was able to draw beautiful art. Now it's impossible. My view, it's really bad. I see only 20%. I have a lot of epileptic attacks. And what's coming? I'm really scared. But those papers give me a lot of rest in my mind, because I know when it's enough for me, I have those papers.
All right, Peter Imbued. I mean, that was a 37-year-old woman, Marieke Vervoort, explaining what the option of euthanasia means to her. It actually ameliorates her daily life now, so that she can get through to the point that, as she put it, she has when she has more bad days than good, that is when she will decide to make her exit. Surely you wouldn't deny that to all people, but specifically children as well. They are obviously human beings who deserve exactly the same kind of rights.
Well, there is no such thing as the right to die, or really here the right to be killed. It doesn't exist anywhere in international law. It certainly doesn't exist anywhere, I think, in any kind of proper moral philosophical system. But, you know, this is exactly the case that we see when we have the legalization of assisted suicide and euthanasia. The creation of a culture in which people don't value themselves because of who and what they are, rather because of what they can or cannot do. And that unfortunately affects more specifically very vulnerable groups of people, including people who are disabled, as in this case, we're talking about Paralympians. If Usain Bolt decided that he only wants to live a certain number of years because after a certain point he wouldn't be able to do certain things, we would all be rightly aghast about that decision. We would want to help him to see that actually his life has much more meaning than simply being able to do or not do different things. And because this is a Paralympian, for some reason we have a much less integral view. And I think this is precisely an illustration of what many disability rights activists in the UK are very much worried about, as well as internationally, that as soon as you legalise euthanasia or assisted suicide, it's precisely people like the disabled who mostly come under the microscope and who are most adversely.
All right, Philip. Now, if a child isn't old enough to be given the right to vote, the right to drive, the right to get married, the right to drink spirits, as is the case in Belgium, why should they be given what is arguably the most fundamental responsibility, the right to choose to live or die?
Well, why have they got the right to be ignored as well? I mean, what are we saying here? That because they're children and because they're suffering intolerable situation, that their views are not to be listened to because they're children? The point is, I think, that we have to show compassion to these children. We can't simply disenfranchise them because they don't make the cut-off age of 18, or tell them to wait for 2 years, endure their suffering, and when they get to be the age of 18, then we'll compassionately allow them to end their lives. And the thing about Peter's argument is that he will never accept that a person has the right to make this decision. He doesn't like the fact that Marieke has decided that she actually benefits from knowing she's got a choice, and that's what euthanasia laws do. They allow a person to know they're back in control, and that's very therapeutic. To simply say that it should never happen is simply ignoring the reality of the way people feel. Now, the world that Peter wants may not have people getting this option, but many people demand it, and I think they should be listened to, including the terminally ill 17-year-old that we're talking about here. We cannot deny this request simply because they don't meet the cut-off age.
All right, Ute, I'm just really struggling with this concept of children having the competencies, the awareness, the understanding of the nature and the severity, the gravity of the decision that is being put in front of them in Belgium. I'm just wondering what you think about an 8-year-old who is in a most unspeakable situation of pain and discomfort. But there is increasingly advanced palliative care, isn't there, these days?
No, there's not. I believe that's highly overrated. Of course, there are solutions, and many of these children benefit from palliative care. But as we just heard from Philip, I think it's about the choice that the patients had. And first of all, the discussion is not about a choice between life and death. The discussion is about a choice how you want to die. There is no life for these children. They are going to die, and sometimes in very painful circumstances, or maybe very abruptly with a lot of trauma for the family that they are leaving behind. And so I believe there is no choice between life and death, because if these children wouldn't ask for euthanasia, or these adults, they would die, and maybe a few weeks later in maybe very difficult circumstances. So it's all about how you want to die, and if you want to orchestrate your death, or do you want to let nature take its course. It's all the same, but it's just as we just heard, the fact that you are able to express yourself and tell the doctors, I don't want to go through with this suffering. I would rather die quietly in my bed instead of going on suffering, and just being able to express that, and people listening to you and having a possibility that it might be really implemented. That's what the law is all about, and that's what's the most important. And so I think we should close the discussion about the struggle between, or choosing between life and death, but because that's not the issue.
OK, and Peter, you've just heard there that the situation is so dire that it's not a matter of life or death at all. And furthermore, children, no matter their age, they have the right to freedom of expression, and they should be listened to.
Well, I certainly think it's the case that in Belgium and places like that, palliative care isn't good enough, and that's partly because it's been retarded by the legalisation of assisted suicide and euthanasia. It is nowhere near the specialism that it is in the United Kingdom, where we have a much greater compassion and greater concentration on compassion in palliative care than in these places that have legalised these practices. You know, I think that going back to what Dr. Nitschke said, he's actually right and wrong in two ways. He's right in the sense that the right to die, we grant this idea of the right to die, the right to be killed in this case, but it cannot be limited to certain groups of people. It has to be given to everyone equally, and that includes people maybe who are underage as well. But he's wrong in the sense that this is not about me feeling uncomfortable about euthanasia or assisted suicide. We don't base laws on whether we like things or don't like things. We base things on fundamental principles, and the fundamental principle that we have in our society, in the UK and elsewhere, is the value of human life and the right to life of every human being, particularly the most vulnerable members of society. And as soon as you allow practices like assisted suicide and euthanasia, you put their lives in jeopardy and their welfare as well. There are so many people who have said, if I had been allowed to commit assisted suicide whilst I was a certain stage of illness, then I would have done, and I would have lost out on years and years and years of really worthwhile living. So assisted suicide and euthanasia should not be allowed precisely because it adversely affects the most vulnerable people in society. Maybe there are some very strong people who would benefit from it insofar as they would be allowed to die quicker than they otherwise would. But there are many, many more people who are much more vulnerable, easily pressured into death by unscrupulous relatives and others, who would be much more adversely affected by this kind of practice. That's why it is wrong, and it should not be allowed, because it's a violation of the human right to life.
So, Philip, I put that to you then. This is a violation of the inalienable right to life for all of us.
Look, of course there's a right to life. It's a precious gift. But what sort of gift is a gift that you can't give away? I mean, obviously that's not a gift, it's a burden. So the idea is we've got the precious gift of life, but at some point we have to acknowledge that some people are in such strife that they want to be able to give that gift of life back, and I think it needs to be listened to. Look, Peter can have those beliefs, and he doesn't have to comply, he doesn't have to agree. I mean, but the fact is he has to acknowledge that most people in these countries that we're talking about want change. They want to have this option. Now, he doesn't have to take that path, but he needs to acknowledge that many people see this as a humane and civilising way that the world needs to move. That's my position. I want this choice. I hope I don't need it, but I want to know that the option's there, and if I get myself into a serious situation, like Marika, I want to know that whether I'm disabled or not, that I have this choice to be able to say enough is enough, and this precious gift of my life I want to give back in the most humane and peaceful way. Now, Peter can go and die in whatever way he likes, but he shouldn't be shoving his views down my throat.
All right, let's go to Ute in Brussels. And I'm just wondering, obviously Belgium is quite a religious country. There are many, many people who subscribe to either Islam or Catholicism. What part does faith play when you are dealing with patients and this whole subject? Because of course it's forbidden to commit suicide in Islam, and the Catholic Church looks very poorly upon the whole issue of euthanasia. So how do you navigate the area of faith?
Well, it's just part of the discussion. So, of course, if I would never ever dwell on euthanasia in a family where I believe there's no openness towards it. The question has to come from the patient and nobody else. So you can express your thoughts on that in a general way, saying that euthanasia is one of the choices the patient can make in the end of life stage. But after all, the question for euthanasia should come from the patient and the family. And of course, you know that, for example, in a Muslim family, that question will probably not come. But that's the interaction we make. So I express my openness to listening to whatever the patient wants or thinks at that time, and trying to follow their wishes as closely and best as possible, which of course is not always easy, especially, and that's beyond the scope today, but especially in, for example, very young children where there is no law. So it can be really difficult for a physician to do what's best for the child and take religious aspects into account as well. But we do our very best every day.
So Peter, in an advanced, developed society, the impression I'm getting from our other two contributors is that they view this as a humane and civilized option to be given to those who are suffering unbearably. Shouldn't people be given the choice? And obviously providing that there is a rigorous system of checks and balances to make sure that those abusers, potential abusers, are filtered out.
Well, unfortunately, killing is never compassion. And what we've found is that there has never been a case where a system has been created that can look into the hearts and the minds of individuals to know with infallible certainty that they are choosing this without any kind of undue pressure, without any kind of coercion whatsoever, even very subtle forms of it. There simply isn't a system that can do that. What you're doing, and this is why this actually goes back to Nitschke's point earlier on, this isn't about me imposing my views on other people. This is about society saying, you know what, if we're going to have a society that is truly compassionate, that truly believes in the common good, and that most of all wants to protect the most vulnerable members of society, we have to have a system that says, okay, how can we best cater for the majority of people as best we can, and give as best we can the care to those minorities of people who want to commit suicide. Suicide is actually legal. You can go and commit suicide yourself if you want to. What you don't have is the right to have someone else help you to do it.
Okay.
Because as soon as you introduce that system, that's when the vulnerable get hurt very badly.
Philip, can we end on a personal note? Because I understand that you have actually personally assisted in the suicide of others, and it must have a very profound effect on you.
It did. I was the only doctor who used a law that lasted briefly. It was the world's first in the Northern Territory in 1996, which allowed a lethal injection to be provided. And I provided a lethal injection to 4 of my terminally ill patients. And it is a very difficult experience. I mean, I made a machine in the end which allowed the person themselves to press the button and the machine delivered the injection, because I didn't want to be sitting alongside that patient and delivering that lethal injection. But I was passionate about that person's right to be able to put an end to their suffering, and their families who were all present during those 4 deaths, they all had the same overwhelming feeling when the end came. They were that the person who had died had finally put an end to their suffering, and the families were grateful. Many of them said they were in the right place at the right time. They were in a place, in a country, that had the courage to bring about these laws. And now, of course, we see them in Holland and Belgium and many other European countries and American states, and the world is changing. And people like Peter are going to have to come to grips with the fact that he's on the wrong side of the argument.
I'm going to have to stop you there and thank you at the same time. Philip, Peter and Ute, thank you all very much indeed for a very interesting conversation. And as ever, thank you for watching. You can see the programme anytime you like by going to the website aljazeera.com. And if you want more discussion on this controversial issue, you can go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can join the conversation on Twitter as well. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. But from me, Martine Dennis, and the whole team here in Doha, for now, it's goodbye.